I can't believe that after 2 years of avoiding COVID, not going anywhere, literally not leaving my house, the only place I actually got COVID was in my own home.
I'm done.
I'm done. I am done.
Oh God forbid, touch wood, please. Um, but I feel like that just kind of speaks to how crazy the pandemic, I mean, is getting, and like the transmissibility of it now, and like how bad it's becoming, and how bad it's like, I don't even want to say bad, but I feel like how unavoidable it's becoming, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because I was thinking about the last time that you and I recorded an episode, how it it's come so full circle, but also at the same
Yeah.
time, not at all. Because the last time we recorded, we were wrapping up on like coming out of the pandemic and what our thoughts were. And now we're going back a step and going back into the pandemic. Like I can't
Yeah.
even count anymore of how many times we've been in this situation.
I know. And I feel like I was saying this to you, and I was like saying it to somebody at work, where I feel like at this point, we should be the ones like giving these press conferences, because it literally confounds me that everybody around, I'm going to say Ontario, but like everybody that I spoke to kind of knew we would be back in this step, or in this phase, or whatever we're calling it, of lockdowns, except for like people who were like making the decisions for these lockdowns. By which I mean, like, our government was like, we are closed, everybody, it's a pandemic. Okay. And then it was like, this summer, we're open. Everybody go outside. And then they were like, never mind, it is the winter. It's flu season, back to school, holiday season, blah, blah, blah. Everybody back inside. It's the pandemic. And we learned nothing from that. Like, we learned nothing from a whole year of doing that, because then when it was summer again, we just literally did the exact same thing again. That I'm like, everybody could have told you we would have had another surge. We would have like gone back into lockdown because we eased up so much.
Mm.
It was like bound to happen.
But it's not even, it's I have such a hard time with it because when we were in that period when things had eased up, we felt so good about it. We felt so good about where we were and where this was going. And I literally sound like we're like dating the pandemic. We're like, and we felt so good about where we were in that position. But I think looking back and looking at where we are now, the biggest thing that sticks out in my mind is just a lack of accessibility across the board for anything and everything and everyone. Like you can't get a booster
Yeah.
unless you know someone who's a pharmacist. You
Yeah.
can't get a test unless you are someone who is vulnerable, to which they haven't even defined what that even
Yeah.
means.
Like, what does that even mean?
You can't get um, literally anything because they've just limited it so much. And so just a lack of accessibility for anything regarding healthcare has just plummeted.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think that it's plummeted, and like is also why I feel like it's inevitable. And it's obviously a privileged position to be able to be saying this,
Yes.
but I think it's inevitable that everybody is going to get COVID in some way, shape, or form. And I say that not because people aren't doing things that they should be, but because there is literally like a lack of resources, a lack of accessibility, but it's also a lack of putting, I don't know, like putting people first,
Yeah.
which I'll explain. I'll explain. Like, I feel like there was a lot of like emphasis on what an individual by themselves needs to do in order to not get COVID, which is like, like social distance, wear a mask, like stay 6 feet away from people, um, whatever, like don't interact with people outside of your house, don't travel, don't do this, don't do that. And I think there was a lot of emphasis on what you as an individual could do, but it wasn't equally weighed with what say the government or like the state in this situation was going to be able to do to protect people. Like the rollout, I mean, I'm going to speak specifically for here in Canada. The rollout of vaccinations was botched. It was like, I think it was so delayed. And then when we talk about like how restrictions have come and gone and come again and gone again and come again, it's been, it seems like it's very arbitrary.
Yeah.
And the lack of, it's kind of like you said, like the lack of resources, the lack of like support for people who might need medical attention, COVID or otherwise, has completely dissipated. And so I feel like when you test positive, like you generally speaking, there's so much shame. Like you're like, what could I have done differently? Like, what did I do wrong? Like, what did I, you know, how did I get it? Like, what did I do? But it's like it's not even about that anymore.
Yeah.
And arguably maybe never was about that, but I think because of the emphasis on like an individual's actions, which don't get me wrong, are obviously very important, but cannot be like the be all end all
Yeah.
of like ending or whatever the pandemic.
It's such a so my it started someone in my family got it
Yeah.
and it quickly spread within my house.
Yeah.
So we literally, the government at first was like, you need to isolate for 10 days. So we're like, okay, we're going to isolate for 10 days. Then they're like, no, it's fine. You can isolate for 5 days and you can be fine. So we were like, actually, no, we're going to isolate for 12 days.
Yeah.
We're just going to take your 5
Yeah.
days. We're going to double them. And then we're going to add an extra 2 days and just not leave our house. But I think what I found most interesting was, thankfully, because we all had the booster, our symptoms were super mild, which I know is a very
Yeah.
privileged thing to say. So I felt very grateful for that. And I was so grateful to have my family, at least like it not be as serious as I feared it would be. But I found that had this been a regular cold, I would have probably just gone about my day as usual.
Yeah.
But because it's COVID, there's an added weight on your chest. Like it's really
Yeah.
a mental thing.
Yeah. No, I totally get that because I think it's like not anymore about which sounds silly and I'll kind of explain it, but I think there's been so much like fear instilled and
Yes.
arguably rightfully so around and about COVID that when you get it, it's like
Oh my God.
it's yeah, it's like you feel however you feel, which might not even be that bad. But then because it is or is not COVID, you feel a certain way. Like, for example, I wasn't feeling well and I took a test and it was negative. I mean, we can go also back and forth on whether or not like the accuracy of PCR tests and whatnot. Yes, absolutely. But I felt relief when I was like, oh, it's negative.
Mhm.
Fully well knowing it doesn't change how I feel if it were positive. Like I wouldn't feel like my body wouldn't be like, oh, never mind, it's not a cold, it's COVID. Your symptoms are worse now.
Yeah.
And fully well knowing that this could be like a false positive, a false negative.
Yeah.
And it could be positive if I do a PCR that I don't have access to or whatever, like whatever the case might be. But it's just silly because that makes no sense to think about it like that. And I feel like it's such a mental, it's like mind over matter, but it's also again like the idea that like you've done something, that you've gotten it, that you've whatever. Because I immediately start thinking back like, okay, where have I been? What have I done? Like who have I come in contact with? And that's not even necessarily necessary, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
No, 100%. I when we first tested positive, um, we really struggled to find like any useful information from the government. Like we
Yeah.
kept hearing that we need to be contacting a public health representative, like we need to be done. I was like, should I call up Justin Trudeau personally and
Literally.
let him know I
The
have COVID? Like,
WHO. Hello.
what do I do? Um, so I also found that there was like a lack of not transparency, but like a lack of relative information. There was like a whole lot of nothing if you
Yeah.
were to look for it on the government website. So
Yeah.
we ended up doing a lot of our own research, which obviously is the theme of the pandemic. I'm like doing my own research. And a lot of what I found were articles that were saying that like don't feel shame if you test positive.
Yeah.
So it's just this like recurring theme on a global scale where people
Yeah.
tested positive and suddenly felt this shame. And I think it just goes back to what you were saying about it kind of being demonized. And when people
Yeah.
did get it, it was like, oh, well, they were just being reckless and that's why they got it. And
Yeah.
so you kind of internalize that.
Yeah, and I actually think it's like a very specifically created narrative, like by the government to be like, if you get it, it's your fault because it absolves them of any guilt and responsibility that they would have to take for
100%.
having so many citizens get COVID or be sick or whatever. And I feel like it's a way to be like, well, we did everything, but it was you. Like you personally didn't do anything. Never mind the fact that there's no paid sick leave. Never mind the fact that we're not prioritizing like frontline workers or giving people the resources that they need, free childcare, so they keep having to have to go into work. Like there's so many different levels to this that I'm like, it's a very like difficult position to be in. But I think I see, we in Ontario talk about our government. I mean, Nadine and I have been like so critical about our government. We're like one step away from like literally calling out Justin Trudeau and like Doug Ford.
We have.
We have, yeah,
We
literally.
literally have.
We really have. Um, but when we're like when we're thinking about people who are in power and like the decisions that they're making, I never will understand like why some of the decisions that are being made because it seems like it's literally going against common sense. For example, the fact that schools are closed right now, but malls are open. But restaurants are closed, but malls are open.
Yeah, it's very selective.
It's very selective.
It's hard not to I keep reminding myself that like I literally can't even put it into words, but for example, we were all watching the news and there was this it was like a few days ago, so it wasn't the most recent announcement, but the one before that when they said that PCR testing would only be for the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to take your frustration out on the messenger, but
Yes,
there's a whole system behind them
absolutely.
that curates the message that they're giving to the public. So for example, when they were like, we're going to be limiting PCR testing, in my mind, I was like, that is ridiculous. Like, how are you now going to be tracking COVID cases? Like, how are you going to be, how can you just,
Yeah.
how, like, you're telling people that all they have to do is isolate for 5 days and then they just like call it a day, they're fine. It doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense. But then at the same time, okay, if we are in the situation we're in, which is very limited testing, very limited resources, that's obviously causing a massive strain on our healthcare workers. So it does make sense that you're limiting testing for
Yeah.
people, but that's not at the fault of either the healthcare workers or supply chain. It's at the fault of government and their
Yeah.
lack of leadership.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. I also just think that it's really difficult because when we talk about like having access to healthcare, whatever, like a big thing that comes up with COVID is like, well, everyone's going to get it. If you're vaccinated, like you'll be fine. Like if you're vaccinated, like you're going to be fine. Like nothing's really going to happen. You might have like mild cold and flu symptoms, but other than that, like you're going to be okay in a week. That's sort of like the general narrative if you've been fully vaccinated 2 or 3 shots. But it and I'm not trying to like defend anti-vaxxers because I genuinely feel like you should get vaccinated and I feel like it's not something new that's like being forced on people, but I'm not even going to get into that argument because it's like a whole world to get into. What I'm trying to say is people who maybe cannot get vaccinated for health or medical issues
Yeah.
or people who um are more at risk, like how like saying everybody's going to get the virus or get COVID during the pandemic, like we're losing like how we get there. If that
Mhm.
makes sense. Like we're losing how we're going to get to like an endemic phase or stage because we're not like necessarily accounting for all of these other people that are slipping through the cracks. And I think that like when you think about it like that, I'm like, okay, maybe it makes sense that PCR tests are limited specifically to people who are at higher risk.
Right.
But what does higher risk mean?
Yeah.
And how do you qualify that? And how are you going to tell somebody, no, sorry, I'm not going to give you a PCR test because you're not high risk? When I so I had like rapid tests, but they were from my sister's school, and we had, of course, my sister had like lost them in our
Mhm.
house somehow. And I was like scrambling to find them. And but before we did, I called up like every single doctor. No doctor was like seeing me. I was like, I really have like my tonsils are sore. I don't know if that's a symptom of COVID, but everything is a symptom of COVID. Like I just want to see somebody. I don't have anything else. No doctor
My
would
my depression is a symptom of
my
at
my
this point.
literally my anxiety, it's a symptom of COVID. It truly actually is. Anyways, I like literally called up every single doctor. Nobody would see me. Um, and in that moment, I was thinking, but like, what if I had something else? Like, what if I had, God forbid, something else going on and it's manifesting in the symptom and like nobody is seeing me because of COVID? So that's the first thing. And
Yeah.
then the second thing is I finally like I there's like one clinic that was seeing people. So I called them to make an appointment. And they were like, okay, we can see you tomorrow. And I was like, oh my God, amazing. Like, I will be there. What time? And they were like, oh, but do you need to come in for a PCR test? And I was like, I just figured like that's what I would be getting when I went to this doctor. And they were like, oh no, if you want to come in specifically for a PCR test, they basically gave me a date that was 8 days out.
Yeah.
I was like, at that, and that was like right before they said that PCR tests are only for people who are high risk. But I was like, if God forbid I did have COVID, which whatever, everybody has COVID now. I'm kind of resolved that everybody's going to get it. It's not even going to be there. It's not going to be waiting in my body being like, "Oh, well, you know what? She has a test booked for 10 days out from now. I'm going to hang out to wait to show up on this freaking PCR test." One, and then two, I was like, "Okay, what are some other ways I can get access either to a rapid or PCR test before thank
Yeah.
God we found my sisters?" They're selling um rapid and PCR tests for travel,
Yep.
but they're like $200. Like, talk about furthering the disparity of like equitable like having access to resources equitably.
Yes. Yes. 100%. I I I my entire family, like we laugh about it. It's not funny, but we laugh about it,
Yeah.
have pretty much just gone under the radar completely from any
Yeah.
public health unit in terms of like us testing positive and there being a record of it, because we tested positive and we somehow found out that we needed to get an official PCR test because that's how your public health official is going to call you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Try to book a PCR test through like through Shoppers, so through the pharmacy. Said they'd contact us within 48 hours. I still haven't heard from them. I haven't been ghosted harder than anyone than I have been by Shoppers. First of all. Second of all, we booked an official, quote unquote, official PCR test through the government website. Same thing. It was like a week out.
Oh my
So
God. Yeah.
by the time, and so my sister did end up going to her test. She happened to have a test book within like the next couple days.
Yeah.
She went to her test. By the time she got her test result, it was positive, but it was like after we were done quarantining.
Yeah. So you're like, great.
So I literally was like, well, thank God, not thank God that you tested positive,
Of
but thank God it
course.
wasn't negative. All of this would have literally been for nothing
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
So it is,
No,
it's crazy.
it's such a mess. So like I and like talking about just stupid things in the pandemic. I got vaccinated in the States. So I have like the little like CDC card that show both my records of vaccination. And so I got an appointment for a booster literally by luck in mid-December.
This girl says luck, but she booked 10 different appointments.
I actually have appointments booked all the way through January.
Yeah.
If anybody is looking, which everybody is. Anyways, that's not the point. The point is that I literally had this booked. Um, they didn't ask me anything. Like they were just like, book your booster. I was like, okay. Went to go book my booster. They were like, where was the location of your first shot and your second shot? And I said, I literally clearly said New York, USA, New York, USA. And they're like, okay, great. Like, came up as an option. Let me book it, everything. I get to the pharmacy. I wake up at like 9 o'clock on a Saturday, which I mean, I get there at like 9 o'clock on a Saturday, which I literally hate waking up early. I never wake up early. And I fill out the form and I wait there and I do everything. And they're like, oh, did you get your first and second shot at Shoppers? And I was like, no, I didn't. And he's like, oh, okay, no worries. I'm going to pull it up on your health card. And he's like, is this your first shot? Because I don't see it on your health card. I was like, oh yeah, I got it from the States. Like, this is my proof of vaccination. And he just goes, this is a pharmacist. He goes, I can't give it to you. Like, you have to call up your public health unit and you have to get them to, like, you have to like tell them what it is. And then they have to like confirm it and then put it on your health card, like a record of it on your health card.
What's their number? Literally, what's when you call them to tell them you got the
I
vaccine?
freaking called. He was like, they're closed today. I was like, do you think this has stopped me? I called them. I called their their hotline, spoke to somebody. She was like, I can't do anything, but I'm going to put in an emergency email request. She put it in. I called back 30 minutes later. I was like, this is like my request. Can you please like whatever?
Process it.
Yeah, like advance it or whatever. Did advance it again. Somebody called me back. Again, this was a Saturday. So they called me back on the weekend, this public health unit person. And she was like, we are so flooded. Like, I don't know when we're going to be able to have this. Like, don't expect it for 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. So I have not yet gotten my booster because of this administrative issue. And part of me is like, okay, you know what? You need to have compassion for people who are working through this, like the people who are trying to put in policy, trying to figure out what's happening. But on the other hand, I'm like, we are literally not giving people boosters like me on this stupid administrative issue. Like, it's honestly, it infuriates me to this day. I mean, it's been like 2 weeks. I'm like, to this day, like it was like 10 years ago, but I think about it and I'm like, this is so frustrating. But like, again, another example of how we have like completely failed. Like, what if I didn't have access to a computer and I had to like go to the library to book my booster? I now would have to go back and say I don't have access to a car. I now have to like, and say I don't have a lot of money. Like, I would have to pay for multiple buses or some form of transportation.
Yeah.
If I was working a shift job, would have had to have taken time off of my job, which means less money again, put myself in front of like however many people are taking public transport, and then have done all of that for nothing, and then have to redo everything all over again.
It doesn't make any sense. And now if you want a booster, you have to wait until March.
Yeah, I
And
know.
that is wait until March and be on a wait list.
Exactly. No, it's literally insane. And like, I don't even understand what the point of it is. Like, if it's going to take me so long to get them to just record my first 2 vaccinations, I imagine it would take them just as long for them to switch my first to my third and be like, oh, there was like a clinical error. Like, the first should be the third. Like, these are your first 2. Anyways, and the reason I'm saying that is because now I think back and I'm like, I should have just said, yes, it's my first and just gotten it as if it were my first and like moved on with my day.
Yeah.
But
Honestly, what is it? Hindsight is 2020.
yes,
Like,
exactly.
there's literally in that moment no way you would have known. And I bet you, had you done that, if something as small as this became this like massive administrative task, I can only imagine the like confusion it would just cause. Or maybe not, like literally maybe it would have just been easier for you after all. But I feel like if something this small got this big, and then I feel like something like that would have been even bigger.
Yeah. Part of me is like, who cares? I would have been vaccinated. I would have been triple vaccinated. It didn't matter. But
At
no,
this
you're right. You're
at
right.
this point, people are talking about administering fourth shots, so you may as well have just started from scratch. You may as well
I
have
might
just
as
been
well be
like,
like, you know, this is my first. And then
I'm
I'll get my
fresh.
second. And then God knows how many more. And that's the other thing too, is like now they're like, everybody's gonna get a third shot, then they're gonna get a fourth shot, maybe a fifth shot. And I think I'm like, at World, we are not even able to give everybody equitably a first vaccine. You're trying to tell me we're gonna get 5, we're gonna get 4, and like, so I was talking to my aunt about this and she was like, you should just go, you should just drive across the border, get a vaccine and come back. And I was like, honestly, I really should. But aside from doing that, why are vaccines so easily accessible in the States till right now, till today, whether it's your first, your second, or your booster? And I'm like, I was like thinking about this as I was listening to the TV the other day, like to the news, but they were talking about how there's going to be more variants, there's going to be more strains, da, da, da. And I'm like, well, yeah, because the world is not vaccinated. Forget about people who choose not to be vaccinated. The people who are like dying to be literally dying to be vaccinated are not getting access to vaccines. And so unless we treat this as like a global health issue, it will never be fixed globally.
Yeah.
And now in the States, in Israel, in Canada, even, we're talking about second, third, fourth booster shots, but we aren't even able to preliminarily vaccinate the world, which means these strains are going to continue to keep going and we're going to continue to have breakthrough infections. We're going to continue to let this virus mutate and grow, whether it's on people who are unvaccinated by choice or not by choice.
But I think, and I know you and I were talking about this, I think this is the like,
Yeah.
again, it's like so bad to say, but this is the quote unquote herd immunity that
Yeah.
people are referring to, because let's say majority of people, at least in Canada, are vaccinated, whether it's like double or triple, then they will have mild to very mild symptoms if they get the Omicron variant.
Yeah.
And then anyone who isn't vaccinated at this point, like this is where I struggle, because it's like, to your point, it's gonna keep mutating. We're gonna keep getting variants, but it's going, by the way it looks now, it's going to hit everybody.
Yeah. But see, and that's so hard because we say it's going to hit everybody and like we're like, "Oh, like it's inevitable, it's going to hit everybody." But it's really hard for people who it's really hard to say that and kind of be okay with it when we think about like say immunocompromised people or people who have
Yeah,
autoimmune disorders or people who just generally are more at risk of severe infection or whatever.
100%. I have I have family members who literally cannot get it. Like they cannot afford to get it. So
Yeah.
and they are they're triple vaxxed. So it like, even with the like
Yeah.
the most amount of protection you can put for yourself,
Yeah.
it's not enough.
No, totally. And I think too, like, that's one thing. And then I think about people who just choose not to get the vaccine. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I feel like we have had enough instances in the past where, in order to go to school, you had to have certain vaccines. In order
Yeah.
to, you know, whatever. The only thing I can think of is like, in order to go to school, you have to have certain vaccines. I'm sure it exists for other things too. But I don't understand why when people when the vast majority of people who are in the hospitals, who are overwhelming hospitals and healthcare, are people who are unvaccinated, why this continues to not be something that can be mandated. And I totally get it that it's everybody's choice, but it's not as though your choice only impacts you, right? Like if you don't get a vaccine, it's not like it impacts only your body and nobody else.
Yep.
And like that's a logic that's been used for many things in the past, right? Like we had to get like the HPV vaccination in school. They were
Yeah.
administered through school. You had to show proof of vaccination for like a bunch of different things before you even started school.
Yep.
Specifically because these things were eradicated because of vaccinations. And now we're like trying to equate that, the argument of like people should not be vaccinated, with like autonomy over people's bodies. And it's like it's not really the same argument,
Yep.
because it doesn't just impact you and your body, and it's not just to say about what you are doing with your body that doesn't have serious impacts on everybody else.
100%. It's almost as if like you not taking that ownership is taking away from the ownership and autonomy of that someone else wants to have
Yeah.
of their
Yeah.
own bodies.
Yeah. And that autonomy, your autonomy of not getting vaccinated takes away someone else's much more minor autonomy of like going to the grocery store
Yeah.
or like going to
Or
the doctor, like being able to get treatment for anything else that's not COVID.
yeah. Deep
It's
breath.
just I know that was like such a deep breath. And but you know what? Like it's so frustrating to think about because in Ontario, I mean, all over the world, it's just a really hard time. And I mean, we're very lucky to live in Canada, live in Ontario, where we did have access to first, second, potentially even your third vaccine. You know, we, for example, don't live in like a super densely populated neighborhood. We can like work from home. We have access to like fresh air. Even, God forbid, when we are sick, we have like backyards or whatever where we can
Mhm.
kind of go and get some space, and houses where we have space from other people in the family. And it's so hard for us. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? And we're out here being like, "Oh my god, it's like so difficult." Like for example, when I was talking to you earlier today, I was like, "Oh, I think my ceramics class has been canceled in January." And I was like genuinely sad about it because over the last, I don't know, over the last like 6 months, I've realized it's really hard for me to stay at home constantly and like
Mhm.
not interact with people, not go out, not do anything. And so I was really excited about this ceramics class when it opened up because I was like, "Oh my god, I've been wanting to do this for so long and like I can finally do it." And I totally get that it's for the best and I'm in no way like disputing that.
Yeah.
But like those small things being taken away from me and I feel it so much. Like I can't even actually imagine what it's like when people's much more serious and important things are taken away from them because we're going into now another lockdown or because there's no access to healthcare or there's no access to testing or space or whatever.
I completely agree. Like I literally have nothing to add because I don't know where we go from here. I mean, I think in some ways too, like the only way to go from here is up. And I think too that we've been
Yeah.
in a similar situation where we're always like, well, it has to get better. It can't get worse. But we've just been yo-yoing between these two
Yeah.
stages. So I think that this is something actually someone that I work with said to me, and it was, in some ways, maybe it's good that they're lessening the like whatever
Yeah.
COVID requirements because then it means that they're starting to normalize it and it's becoming more like a flu
Yeah.
or a cold, which is a good sign, which I do kind of agree with. So I do think that in some ways it will get better from here. Do I think that that this stupid thing is going to go away tomorrow? No, but I think it's like you said, like we do need to transition from a pandemic to an endemic at some point. So is it endemic or epidemic?
I think it's endemic.
Endemic. So we'll see, like only time
We'll tell.
will tell.